Okay, so good morning. This is Lecture 7 of the Religions of Israel by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. And last week we were looking at the prophet Jeremiah as a critical figure in the Deuteronomic revolution. So I want to look at a couple more texts of Jeremiah before we move on to the specifics of the Deuteronomic theology. So if you go to page 1024 in the Tanakh, which is chapter 7 of Jeremiah, this is a somewhat narrative prophecy. It's not in poetic form, but it really sort of exemplifies the covenantal nature of the Deuteronomic ideology, the conditional nature of the covenant versus the royal Davidic cult and the priestly cult of the temple shall never be destroyed idea. So, Cal, do you want to start reading chapter 7?
The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Stand at the gate of the house of the Lord, and there proclaim this word. Hear the word of the Lord, all you of Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord.
So he's standing smack right in front of the main entrance of the temple to deliver this prophecy, which a lot of people are not going to be too happy to hear about. Go on.
Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, mend your ways and your actions, and I will let you dwell in this place. Don't put your trust in illusions and say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these buildings.
Okay, that's the, that's the statement that this place is inviolable. God will never destroy this place because this is God's seat on earth, right? So this is this idea that's found in some of the Zion Psalms that this is an unshakable institution. Go on. No,
if you really mend your ways and your actions, if you execute justice between one man and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, if you do not shed the blood of the innocent in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own hurt, then only will I let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers for all time. See, you are relying on illusions that are of no avail. Will you steal and murder and commit adultery and swear falsely and sacrifice to Baal and follow other gods whom you have not experienced, and then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name and say, we are safe? Safe to do all these abhorrent things? Do you consider this house which bears my name to be a den of thieves? As for me, I have been watching, declares the Lord.
Now, if you look at his criticisms, they follow a lot of the laws that are found in the Ten Commandments and the law codes, right? He's basically, the last part here, steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, sacrifice to Baal. Those are like virtual quotes from the Ten Commandments, right? And the earlier stuff about oppressing the stranger, the orphan, this is very basic to the law codes, right? Exodus especially, but also Deuteronomy. So he's in effect saying, you think you can break the covenant and then stand in this house and say, we are safe to do all these things? Right? He's saying, you guys, and it says it's an illusion. All right, read a little more. Just go to my place.
Just go to my place at Shiloh, where I had established my name formerly, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. And now, because you do all those things, declares the Lord, and though I spoke to you persistently, you would not listen, and though I called to you, you would not respond. Therefore, I will do to the house which bears my name, on which you rely, and to the place which I gave you and your fathers, just what I did to Shiloh. And I will cast you out of my presence as I cast out your brothers, the whole brood of Ephraim.
Critical points, right? Shiloh was the central temple when in the earliest days of the Israelite nation, the main shrine. That's where the ark was, according to, the earlier accounts. And we know that Shiloh was destroyed early on, probably by the Philistines. Hi, good morning, Cantor. So we know that Shiloh was destroyed. Okay, if the archaeology follows it, the text follows it, and so he says, look what I did. And second point, he talks about the place where which bears his name, not where he lives, right? The place where his name dwells. That's a Deuteronomic idea, that God doesn't actually live in the temple. It's the place where God's name is, right? And thirdly, I will cast you out of my presence. I will exile you like I did to the north, your brothers, the whole brood of Ephraim. So Jeremiah is a perfect Deuteronomic, based prophecy. You're breaking the covenant. If you think this place, it's a conditional covenant, it's not an unconditional covenant. If you've got, and also, by the way, it says you've got an opportunity to mend your ways. Repentance, that's part of Deuteronomy as well, right? Again, you see the influence here of Hosea and the earlier prophets, and Jeremiah is right part of this school. It's a conditional prophet. You have a covenant. You have the means to correct yourself. You've broken the covenant, specifically the 10 Commandments, right? You think that this place is inviolable. You're wrong. I destroyed Shiloh. I kicked out the people of northern Israel. I will do it again to you. That's why this is such a very interesting prophecy, because it encapsulates everything that is found in many ways in the book of Deuteronomy, and the idea that the temple is not the literal dwelling place of God. Okay, couple other things. If you go to, let's see now, I don't think we'll do 10. Yeah, let's not. In chapter 10, he does a critique. It's a critique of idolatry, a satire of idolatry, which is very typical of this kind of thing. But look at chapter 16.
Jeremiah?
Yeah, verse 10. No, let's not do that one. Okay, chapter 19, that's the one I want. He goes out and he does...
Verse 1?
1 second. No, that's not the one I'm looking for. Where are we here? Chapter 19, 14 to 20. Yes, okay. That's not right. Hang on, I've got the wrong reference here. Where am I here? Oh, no, starting at verse 14. Okay, here we are. Page 1058, chapter 9, verse 14.
Chapter 19.
Chapter 19, verse 14. Okay. Robert, do you want to start reading?
When Jeremiah returned from
Tophet. Yeah.
Where the Lord had sent him to prophesy, he stood at the court of the house of the Lord and said to all the people, Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I'm going to bring upon the city and upon all its villages all the disasters that I have decreed against it, for they have stiffened their necks and refused to heed my word.
Now, what he'd done at Tophet was previous in the chapter. He'd done a kind of, again, a performance art, smashing a jug and various symbolic actions. But now, look, goes back and he goes into the court of the temple, and he does this prophecy that, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. So now look what happens, the beginning of chapter 20. This is a continuation of the incident.
Pashur, son of Immer, the priest who was chief officer of the house of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesy these things. Pashur thereupon had Jeremiah flogged and put in the cell in the upper Benjamin gate in the house of the Lord. The next day Pashur released Jeremiah from the cell. And Jeremiah said to him, The Lord has named you not Pashur, but Magur Misabib. How would that translate?
Well, it comes down to terror all around.
For thus said the Lord, I am going to deliver you and all your friends over to terror. They will fall by the sword of their enemies while you look on. I will deliver all Judah into the hands of the king of Babylon. I will exile them to Babylon or put them to the sword, and I will deliver all the wealth, all the riches, and all the prized possessions of the city, and I will also deliver all of the treasures of the kings of Judah into the hands of their enemies. They shall seize them as plunder and carry them off to Babylon. As for you, Pashur, and all who live in your house, you shall go into captivity. You shall come to Babylon. There you shall die, and there you shall be buried, and so shall all your friends to whom you prophesied falsely.
Okay, so here it is. This is the guy he's one of the main parts of the temple priestly hierarchy. And remember, Jeremiah is a priest as well. He's a Kohen. And so this chief priest, it says, or chief officer of the house, meaning he's probably the CEO of the whole administration of the temple, he has the power to do this, to take Jeremiah and have him flogged and throw into jail. And why does Pashur do this? Because he's preaching sedition and the destruction of the temple. And obviously the priests, the leaders of the priests had the authority to deal with, people like this, to use a much later term, maybe deemed kind of heretics or rebels or whatever you want. But he figured after flogging him and throwing him in jail overnight, he let him go.
What was the sedition that Pashur was preaching?
Not Pashur, Jeremiah was preaching the sedition.
What's sedition?
Well, he's he's preaching the destruction of the temple.
What's the word sedition?
Well, it means like rebellion. Okay.
Well, what I'm getting at is, what did Jeremiah say that Pashur was doing that was so terrible?
Well, just read the previous prophecy. Okay. In other words, it's all his theme of, you people have been doing or immoral. You haven't been following what you supposed to. You've broken the covenant. And a Pashur being is probably of the, the temple is inviolate. The temple will never be destroyed. And so to hear this guy running around saying this is sedition. It's stirring people up. It's attacking the priestly hierarchy. Here's the material from today, but we're looking at the passages from Jeremiah from last week, actually, before we get on to this week's stuff. Here's one more. So this is another example of how Jeremiah comes into conflict with the temple hierarchy. Now turn to chapter 26.
Are you still on the old?
Yeah, I'm from yesterday, but last week, but you don't need to have it in front of you. Take a look at chapter 26. This again is another conflict with the priestly hierarchy. This is on page 1074. Irma, do you want to read that? 1074 at the bottom, chapter 26.
At the beginning of the reign of King Jehoiakim,
Yes.
son of Josiah of Judah, this word came from the Lord.
This is early on in Jeremiah's career. Like, the book isn't in strict chronological order, but obviously this is the earlier part of his prophetic career. Go on.
Thus said the Lord, stand in the court of the house of the Lord, and speak to the men of all the towns of Judah, who are coming to worship in the house of the Lord, all the words which I command you to speak to them. Do not omit anything. Perhaps they will listen and turn back, each from his evil way, that I may renounce the punishment I am planning to bring upon them for their wicked acts.
Deuteronomic notion of repentance, going back to Hosea, but here it is. Maybe they will repent. Go on.
Say to them, thus said the Lord, if you do not obey me, abiding by the teaching that I have set before you, heeding the words of my servants, the prophets, whom I have been sending to you persistently, but you have not heeded, then I will make this house like Shiloh, and I will make this city a curse for all the nations on earth.
Here again, teaching. This is Deuteronomy. That's the book of Deuteronomy that was found during the time of Josiah, right? Remember, at the time when Josiah found the book and started the revolution, that's when Jeremiah begins his prophetic career. So he's part of this revolution. So,
Are we sure of that? Or
yeah,
sure,
as much as we can date.
Really defined
As much as we can date Jeremiah, yes, that's when he starts. Okay? And notice, I've sent you all these prophets. He's talking about guys like Hosea and Micah, right? And again, repeating the notion, I destroyed Shiloh because of the sins of the people, and Shiloh was the first temple. Really, after they entered land, the main shrine, it was destroyed probably by the Philistines, even before Solomon had built, his temple. It was a ruin. It was a well-known, established fact. We've established this archaeologically as well, that Shiloh was destroyed. Okay, go on. The priests
and prophets and all the people heard Jeremiah speaking these words in the house of the Lord. And when Jeremiah finished speaking all that the Lord had commanded him to speak to all the people, the priests and the prophets and all the people seized him, shouting, "You shall die. How dare you prophesy in the name of the Lord, that this house shall become like Shiloh, and this city be made desolate without inhabitants?" And all the people crowded about Jeremiah in the house of the Lord.
These are precisely the people who don't want to hear this message. The people, right? The priests of the temple, the prophets of the temple. Again, remember, there are other prophets around who are preaching the Zion theology of the fact that can never be a destruction of God's house. And he is standing there and telling them, you are fooling yourself. Right? Okay, read on. So, he's like, his life is threatened at this point. Go on.
When the officials of Judah heard about this, they went up from the king's palace to the house of the Lord and held a session at the entrance of the new gate of the house of the Lord. The priests and prophets said to the officials and to all the people, "This man deserves the death penalty, for he has prophesied against this city, as you yourselves have heard."
There's a trial going on here, in effect. Okay?
Jeremiah said to the officials and to all the people, "It was the Lord who sent me to prophesy against this house and this city, all the words you heard. Therefore mend your ways and your acts, and heed the Lord your God, that the Lord may renounce the punishment he has decreed for you. As for me, I am in your hands. Do to me what seems good and right to you. But know that if you put me to death, you and this city and its inhabitants will be guilty of shedding the blood of an innocent man. For in truth, the Lord has sent me to you to speak all these words to you." Then the officials and all the people said to the priests and prophets, "This man does not deserve the death penalty, for he spoke to us in the name of the Lord."
Now, it's
our
interesting.
God."
It's the priests and the prophets who want to put him to death. The officials and the people who previously were howling for his death, are now saying, wait a minute, he has spoken in the name of the Lord. There is respect for the fact that he is a prophet and that he says, look, I'm only doing this because God has told me to do this, and I'm innocent of any kind of sedition here. Now read the next part is fascinating. Go on.
Some of the elders of the land arose and said to the entire assemblage of the people, "Micah the Morishite, who prophesied in the days of King Hezekiah of Judah, said to all the people of Judah, 'Thus said the Lord of hosts, Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become heaps of ruin, and the Temple Mount a shrine in the woods.' Did King Hezekiah of Judah and all Judah put him to death? Did he not rather fear the Lord and implore the Lord, so that the Lord renounced the punishment he had decreed against them? We are about to do great injury to ourselves."
This is fascinating. All right. The people said 100 years ago, there was a prophet by the name of Micah, who we have his prophecy. You look at the note, Micah chapter 3, verse 12. He predicted Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. The people repented, and God didn't do it. So we shouldn't be so quick to condemn this guy. All right. Now, if you look at the rest of the chapter, it talks about another prophet by the name of Uriah, son of Shemaiah, who we do not have his writings, who was also saying the same things. And the king takes him, and they want to put him to death, and he has to run away to Egypt. But the king sends his men, and they bring him back. They extradite him, and they kill him. So you see, this is not an idle threat. But notice verse 24, one of the family people, notice son of Shaphan. And remember, Shaphan was one of the officials who in the time of Josiah was involved with the reading of the book of Deuteronomy. So his son, who is a court official, is a patron of Jeremiah's. The Shaphan family is one of the families that protect him during his career. Okay? He's got some influence in the court hierarchy, the court bureaucracy, right? And so he protects him, so he was not executed. It's a very interesting passage. Okay, one more passage. Look at chapter 29. I don't think we're going to do 35, but look at chapter 29. Because Jeremiah is an incredibly important prophet. His book and his writing and what happened to him is incredibly important for later Jewish history because of it, once it becomes part of the sacred writings, what he writes has a major impact on later religious thought. And chapter 29 is a letter that he sent. This is after the first wave of exile, when Jehoiachin is deposed and his brother Zedekiah, Jehoniah, King Jehoniah, that's next guy, he is deposed by the Babylonians, sent along to exile to Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And then his brother is put as a vassal king, right? The second wave is when the city is destroyed. But in this first wave, if you take a look at 29, it says, the priests, the prophets, the rest of the elders of the exile community, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. And it talks about the king, the queen, the eunuchs, the officials, the craftsmen, the smiths. So there is still contact between Jerusalem and the exiled king. Now his brother is now king, so in effect there's like two kings, the one in exile and the one in rule. And there is permitted passage. So what happens is that Jeremiah writes this letter that God tells him to write, and it goes in what we would call the diplomatic pouch, because it says the letter was sent through Elisah, son of Shaphan, there you go, the family of Shaphan again, and Gemariah, son of Hilkiah. Remember, who was Hilkiah? He was also one of the people involved back in the time of Josiah. He was the priest, right? So their families are still involved in the administration, and they are taking a diplomatic mission to the exile community, okay? And so he gets to put this letter in the diplomatic pouch. And if you read the letter, it's one of the most influential texts in all of Jewish history, because what does he say in it? He says, here's to the exile community. Build houses, this is verse 5, live in them, plant gardens, eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. This is the origin of the prayer for the country that we say today. And in fact, the traditional prayer for the country uses the very words that are found in this text. Modern prayers for the country don't use it. It's been rewritten. But if you look in an Orthodox Siddur, it still uses the language here. So what is Jeremiah saying? If you read on, essentially what he's saying is, and this is the beginning of the theology of exile, which is really important for the survival of the community in exile and for the creation of a diaspora that remains Jewish. He's saying, God has exiled you there for a reason. Live there. Live according to the laws of the country you live in. This is eventually expanded into the rabbinic principle of Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is law. Secondly, by saying this, he's saying, do not revolt against the occupying power, because God has decreed that Nebuchadnezzar shall do this. So stay put, have faith in God, and then it says later on, if you do this, I'm going to bring you back. And I will bring you back in 70 years. That's when it gets set up. Okay?
What is that at the end of this?
Yeah, it goes on, and he mentions it somewhere else as well. All
It
right?
says 70 years?
70 years. Uh-huh. All right? The point is that he, in effect, says, it goes on into chapter 30, really, about it. But the point is, even if it doesn't say in this particular text, he does go declare again to the exiles that it's going to last only 70 years. Okay? And the point is, here it is in verse 10. When Babylon's 70 years are over, he says, I will bring you back. So what does this say? First of all, it establishes the length of the exile. Turns out he ends up being right. 70 years later, Babylon gets destroyed, Persians take over, Cyrus gives his decree.
Do most modern scholars just believe that was edited later to put
No,
70 in there?
no, he got it right. 70 is a good number, okay? It's
Oh, yeah, it's
10
just
times
seem like
7.
a big
Yeah, I mean,
number, but-
hey, look, for whatever
Long enough that
reason.
no one's going to check. It's like,
Yeah, well, yeah, he
you're not
got.
around when it's
Well, actually, there are some who do survive. Interestingly enough, the whole period. There's children when they go into exile and they come back. 1 second, but the other thing is what is the impact of this? Well, first of all, it establishes 70, and 70 in later apocalyptic literature becomes a critical number in calculating the end. And when the second temple is destroyed, everybody expects that 70 years later it'll get rebuilt. And when it isn't being rebuilt, that's one of the reasons why the Bar Kokhba revolt broke out when it did. Okay? It was close to the 70 years. Secondly, this establishes the idea that you don't revolt against the ruling power because you work with the ruling power, you live with the ruling power, because it's God's decree that this should be so. And therefore, you should not try and force the change back to the reestablishment of your state and the end of your exile, because that's against God's will.
He's talking about the people living in exile.
Yes, but this becomes the ruling political theology of the Jewish people until the 19th century. There are only 4 times in the ancient world where the Jews disobey this idea, where they revolt against the ruling power. Only one was successful, the Maccabean revolt. 3 were utter disasters.
One was Bar Kokhba, one of the other two.
The first is the war where the temple is destroyed. The second is the outbreak of the wars in the diaspora between 115 and 117 that destroys the communities of Alexandria, Cyprus, and Cyrene. Third is the Bar Kokhba revolt. After that, the rabbis incorporate this into their theology very strongly. We will wait for the Messiah.
But it only develops. That's after Bar Kokhba, which was
No, but when you look at it, they played ball with the Persians and they played ball with the Hellenistic empires, and except when Antiochus becomes persecuted, they played along with the Romans for the most part. I mean, don't forget they were under Roman occupation for hundreds of years, and the disasters of the wars against Rome proved to them that Jeremiah was right.
But mostly later. In other words, the earlier periods, I mean, it's a much more iffy thing. I mean,
But they
were defeated. Persians take over fairly quickly.
Yeah, but they could have. You're right. On a practical level, they didn't have the means, but they could have, because don't forget, political subordination was a sign for some Jews that God is not really God. Right? If God was really God, then why is his people being ruled by a foreign power who are worshiping idols? Right? So Jeremiah is in effect saying, hey, Nebuchadnezzar is part of the way I rule in the world. Right? So when you really look at it from this point on, there are only these over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. There's only 4 times where they disobey this advice. And 1 second, and then all the way to the 19th century, essentially Jews acted like this. Yes, there were minor outbreaks of messianic revolts and things like that. But when you look at the whole sweep of Jewish history to the 19th century, and this is the rationale for the anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox. If God doesn't decree it, then we don't move. So what happens in the 19th century? secularization, rise of Jewish nationalism. There's a repudiation of the Jeremiah idea and the rise of Jewish nationalism that says, we're not waiting, we have to take action. We no longer can work with the powers because they are going to kill us. So we have to establish our own home, rule ourselves, and we have to have self-determination. So Jewish nationalism and then Zionism, which is a manifestation of 19th century Jewish nationalism, but not the first manifestation of it, in effect is a rejection of Jeremiah's idea that had kept the Jewish people alive in the diaspora for more than 2,500 years.
When was the war? You said the wars in the diaspora, and you mentioned Alexandria and
115 to 117. Alexandria, Cyprus, and Cyrene, which is what is Tunisia today. Cyprus the Jews were completely wiped out. Cyrene, the community, which was pretty large, was basically destroyed. And the Alexandrian community was so badly decimated that the whole Alexandrian Jewish civilization disappeared. Basically, that's why we don't have a non-rabbinic form of Judaism that is a Greek civilization, because after that, it basically dies out. Okay? So this is a way in which the Deuteronomic theology gets then made into a political ideology, a kind of theo-political ideology that is the basis for living in the diaspora. It's a critical moment. It gives a theological foundation for living in the diaspora. And this is one of the ways in why the Judeans survive as opposed to disappear like the northern tribes did. Okay? The chapter 35, by the way, which we're not going to really look at, just want to tell you a bit about. Chapter 35 is another interesting chapter. It tells how there's a group called the Rechabites, who are this ascetic tribe of Jews who don't live in cities and they live in tents. They're trying to sort of replicate the way Jews lived in the patriarchal period, right? They don't drink wine. They're kind of like Nazarites. They don't drink wine. They don't live in cities. They don't do agriculture. They're pastoralists. But because of the war, they're forced into Jerusalem, right? And the Rechabites, this is a private family covenant that was established by their ancestor.
Which chapter is
This is 35 on page 1100, and they have maintained their loyalty to this covenant of their ancestor. These particular, this is sort of the first kind of sectarian group that we know of, right? This is a proto-sectarian group, and basically they've maintained loyalty to this covenant of their ancestor, and God, through Jeremiah, uses this as an example. Here's a group that stayed loyal to this covenant. How come you can't stay loyal, Judeans, to my covenant? All right? So again, this is the Deuteronomic idea of the notion of the covenant that is central to it. Okay. So now take up the material I gave you today, because we're going to look at the characteristics, the very careful characteristics, and most of the reason why I gave you redid it from last week is because I went through all of these and tried to give you references, specific biblical references to every one of these points. We're not going to look up every single one of them, but you've got them there. Okay. So here, this is it. We've now talked about the history of this Deuteronomic revolution. Now, this is the theology of it. So first of all, it's covenant-centered. And the term brit, you find it more in Deuteronomy than anywhere else in the Bible, practically. They also use the term edut. And it is a conditional contract between God and Israel that was done at Horeb. In Deuteronomy, Sinai is called Horeb. The breach of the covenant brings the curses down upon the people. That's Deuteronomy 30. Okay? If you follow it, here are the blessings. If you don't, here are the curses. It is very similar in form to Assyrian vassal treaties, which helps us to date Deuteronomy.
Can I say, because the same kind of formulations at the end of Leviticus, is that
Yes, Levitic.
Is that also a D source?
No, it's an H source. I'll tell you. We'll get to that. Okay.
So that's where we are now.
Yeah, I know. It's very similar. It's a different school, but very similar idea. Okay, we'll leave that for the moment. What's interesting is that when you look at Deuteronomy's account of the revelation at Horeb, it starts with the whole people. They hear the voice, but then the commandments are all given through Moses. Okay, Moses is extremely important in D. God promises people to give the people the land of Canaan. That's like the old Abrahamic covenant, but they have a permanent obligation to observe God's commandments. So it's a conditional covenant. You want to live in the land, you have to follow that's the point. It's condition. Your living on the land is conditional to observing the commandments, the rules of the covenant. So that's number one. Number two, it is very strictly monotheistic. It is a much narrow monotheism than we have found in the previous way in which the Israelites and Judeans believed in God. There are no angels in Deuteronomy. Okay? One God, one shrine. That's the Shema. And chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, where it says very specifically, there's only going to be one place. Okay, so it's Jerusalem is the only place you're allowed to sacrifice. And we saw that the reform begins under Hezekiah, but really this takes hold under Jeremiah, where all the local shrines are shut down.
So how they cleaned up the Jerusalem so good from Deuteronomy? There's no notion of...
Because don't forget, it's a document that's supposed to be written in the time of Moses, so they don't.
So the editor...
They never mentioned it probably because it's supposed to be an ancient document, right? It's supposed to be a document from Moses.
Okay, so they write it like a...
They write it
novel,
as if...
like a novel, like a historical
But
novel.
this was very typical, I mentioned last week, it's very typical of the age to try and to have documents written from in the names of ancient sages. It was done in other cultures as well. They didn't consider this falsification. They felt it was in the, you might say, the spirit of these people. They didn't see this as an intentional forgery the way we would today if somebody wrote something, and claimed it was a letter written by a historical figure. Okay?
Would that be because traditions were fundamentally oral?
Yes,
The written
exactly.
was really a secondary form, and so they didn't know how far back it really went.
Well, except that they create the you'll see the written form is extremely important in Deuteronomy.
But based on
they felt they were writing in the name of Moses, so to speak. Okay.
This also is where I gather the whole concept of Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe.
Yeah, exactly.
This is a Moses is as the author of the Torah.
Absolutely.
Comes from here.
Absolutely, because he's the author of the teaching. The original teaching, the original Torah, which is Deuteronomy, is from the hand of Moses, right? Don't forget, the rest of the Torah doesn't actually claim to be from the hand of Moses, right?
Right.
Okay, name theology. This is part of the monotheism. God is transcendent and only lives in heaven. There is no presence of God that actually descends to the earth. It's only God's name that dwells in the temple. And the stress on the word because of this, and therefore, this is why prayer is important in the Deuteronomic idea, and on hearing things. You hear the word of God. You pray the word. The word becomes critical. Okay?
So, like, original vision of Isaiah of God is counter to this.
That's the priestly theology.
Right.
That there's an actual physical presence of God that lives in the temple. Right. This is a rejection of that.
And I'm trying to remember the earlier Isaiah, similar time period, slightly earlier.
No, Isaiah is from the time of Hezekiah. Okay, So yes, during the time of that, but Isaiah is far more traditional in that respect. Okay? Now, the sole contact with humanity is through the divine instruction, the Torah, the teachings. Okay? Once the Mosaic revelation has been done, the revelation now dwells within the written text. Yes, there are going to be prophets, but they actually narrow the possibility of that considerably. All right?
Is Moses the only one?
He's the only one that actually gives the instructions. You get people like Jeremiah who are preaching, kind of moral, follow the teaching God is telling me to follow. But Jeremiah is not preaching any new commandments.
Could you add sole contact with humanity is through divine instruction to Moses?
Yes, you can. Okay, the other thing that's very interesting about the Deuteronomic is the emphasis on mind and emotion. Okay? There you see a lot of ideas about the way you think and your inner thoughts, and so there's a rationalistic tendency in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy more than you find in the other law codes, although the other law codes do this also do this, reasons and explanations for the commandments. In other words, why should I do this? Deuteronomy often tells you why you should do it. There is a reason for doing these laws. Okay? The other fascinating thing is that there are a lot of connections between the Deuteronomy and the wisdom tradition. There's a similarity of language between things in Deuteronomy, and I've given you examples of verses in Deuteronomy that have very similar vocabulary to verses in the book of Proverbs. Now, what does this mean? Well, according to the late great scholar of Deuteronomy, Weinberg, he believes that Deuteronomy comes out of the scribes. That it is the origin of Deuteronomy is not through priests and not through prophets, but through the scribes. And the scribes are where the wisdom tradition comes from, which we'll talk about next week. But the point is, whether or not that's true, there is definitely a connection between the wisdom tradition and the Deuteronomic tradition. There's a big difference, however. As you will see, the wisdom tradition says nothing about covenants. And in the wisdom tradition, chokhmah, wisdom, is a basic thing that you learn from studying the universe. It has nothing to do with covenant. So what happens? Deuteronomy is the beginning of the transformation of the wisdom tradition where chokhmah, wisdom, is identified with Torah. By the 2nd century BCE, the identification is complete. Whereas these are two distinct ideas. There is Torah, teaching, revelation, and there is chokhmah, which is a totally different thing. Deuteronomy begins to is the beginning of a process that blends the two together, so that by the time of Ben Sira in around 200 BCE, where it's very explicit that Torah and chokhmah are exactly the same thing, and the rabbis pick this up later on, Deuteronomy is the beginning of this. It's a process.
Right, but with Ecclesiastes, not.
No. Ecclesiastes, it's not. But, Proverbs, Torah, it's not. But here's the very beginning of it.
But it
Okay?
is interesting that Ecclesiastes is not. Ecclesiastes is later than...
But he's very conservative in many ways.
So there were still other viewpoints.
Yeah,
operating
absolutely.
substantially
Absolutely.
Even after the Deuteronomic
Yeah.
Revolution.
As radical as he is, Ecclesiastes is also extremely conservative in certain ways. And he is an exemplar on some level of the wisdom tradition, even as he is rejecting certain parts of it. And the same thing with the author of the book of Job. Okay? So, the other thing that is fascinating about the Deuteronomic religion is the imperative to love God with inner devotion. You do not find anywhere else in the Torah the notion that you must love God and that God loves you. So the notion of ahava, love between God and his people, is central to the relationship, the divine-human relationship in Deuteronomy. So you get Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, part of the Shema. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha v'chol meodecha. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your life and all your might. Right? Okay? That's only in Deuteronomy. And it's in chapter 10, and there's also this notion of cleaving to God, davak. Cleaving, clinging, attaching yourself. This is almost mystical, right?
Yeah, but if God's in heaven, how can you cling to him?
You know, the rabbis asked that very same question. So how do you cleave to God? It's an emotional state. It's not because the term cleave, by the way, is used in when it describes Adam and Eve, right? A man clings to his wife, cleaves to his wife. It's almost the sexual act. But here, you're right, it's not a physical thing. It's not a physical thing. It's an emotional attachment.
Except when the Kabbalists came in.
Well, even before the
physical.
No, even before the Kabbalists, the mystics picked this up as the rationale for the mystical communion with God.
But I think this more sexual overtone.
Yes, it comes out more in Kabbalah. Okay, the other thing is Deuteronomy is the one that really shows what you might call the holy war idea, right? It's actually...
What about free will?
Oh, sorry, free will, yes. Another critical point in Deuteronomy, famous passage, choose life and so on. Free will is central to Deuteronomy. You have the free will to either follow the covenant or break the covenant. God's not going to force you. There are, that's really important in Deuteronomy. Free will is extremely important. Okay.
Was that less the case before? There wasn't really...
Well, don't forget, in the earlier traditions, you have this notion that God is, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. You get this notion in the earlier texts that there is both a divine plan and free will, that there's this contradictory idea that somehow God is directing things. On the other hand, humans have a measure of free will, and in some way, it's not what we would call theologically consistent. Right? All right?
Also here in Deuteronomy, because don't you have the same thing in a different sense, which is you're going to break the covenant, but then God's going to take you back.
Yeah, there's a certain, you see, the point is you're not talking here about strict philosophical logic here.
Right.
Okay? But the fact is that this is the only place where it very explicitly says you've got the ability to choose. Okay? Okay, so then D, Deuteronomy exhibits what you find in other ancient Near Eastern ideas, the notion of the holy war. And it's actually in the earlier Israelite Judean religion. But what's interesting is that by the time of Deuteronomy, there are no Canaanites. I mean, the Phoenicians are Canaanites, but it's not. In other words, when it tells you to wipe them all out and kill them all, there's actually nobody there to do this to. Okay? So why did they put this in? Well, some scholars believe that D is actually talking about Israelites who adhere to the older religious practice, that there's a polemic here against the followers of the old traditions. They then become, like the ancient Canaanites, these terrible idol-worshipping people. So, in fact, the holy war stuff in Deuteronomy is actually an internal holy war, not against an external enemy, but it's couched in the language of the old holy war traditions that came out of the earlier stuff and existed in other cultures. This is not. This is
theory is this?
What?
Whose theory is this?
This is what. This is Weinberg. This is
That
Geller.
is a much harder topic, because you could easily just say it's in there because by the time they're there, there's no more Canaanites. I.e., we have proven the case.
Yes, there
They
are
were wiped out.
Yes, there are those who
this
say
shows
that
how
because
good
there are
God
no
is.
Canaanites, we wipe them out, and this is why you get
And this is why they were wiped out.
right. But
You know.
some scholars believe, in fact, but why does Deuteronomy even mention it? The fact that it mentions it is that in effect it's talking about an internal war. Okay.
But that's like saying the Jews there were Canaanites, and that's sort of a hard.
It's taking the category of Canaanite as an abhorrent idol-worshipping people. It's like you take your ancient enemy and you use that as you attach that, like we call our later enemies, Haman, the Amalekites, right? When Jews attach those names of our ancient enemies to contemporary figures all along throughout Jewish history, they're doing the same thing. There are no Amalekites around anymore. But by saying these terrible people or enemies are Amalekites, it's bringing it into a certain dynamic. So by saying those Judeans who do not follow the covenant in the way, they are like Canaanites and should be treated like Canaanites. They are Canaanites on some level.
I get the threat part, but which I think that makes a lot of sense. But
Yeah.
you label people who are potentially your internal enemies as external. It's classic. It's like calling.
Yeah, exactly.
It's what McCarthy did. It's like
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
But to say that equals an actual persecution and an internal, like almost like civil war against these people.
Yeah, but it never happened. It never
Right.
happened.
So I don't know. Right. Is there any evidence of?
No, it never happened.
Well, what do you mean it never happened? This is exactly what happened. Jeremiah was preaching against what he thought was impure.
Yeah, but there
religious
was,
practice.
but the followers of Jeremiah didn't like. There wasn't a civil war going on at that time. Jeremiah had no power. Okay, I mean the D people, they had power under Josiah. So you got to look at it. I mean Josiah, in some ways, carried out this program. Okay, that was a kind of internal holy war.
But it doesn't say they actually killed.
Well, there's some people he did kill. Okay, if you look, there are people he did kill. The priests who actually functioned at idolatrous shrines, he killed them.
But I thought he pulled them.
No. The ones who are at the local shrines that were worshiping God, he pulls them into Jerusalem. The ones who are the priests at the temples to Baal and he murders them. Okay, so there is some evidence for this. Okay, you think those people were foreigners? They were probably Judeans. Okay, text religion. Deuteronomy really develops the notion that God is to be found in the text. If God isn't in the middle of the temple, where is God? God's in heaven. How do you experience God? Through the text. This is a very important idea that becomes extremely powerfully influential. It underlies the whole ethic of the study of Torah by the rabbis. George Steiner, the great literary critic, once gave a speech at the Jewish Theological Seminary called Our Homeland, the Text. He was arguing that the true homeland of the Jews is not the physical land of Israel, but the text.
When did he do that?
Oh, when I was at the seminary, sometime around 1980.
Who is it?
George Steiner.
Was
He-
listening to him as difficult as reading him?
I was fascinated by what he said because he picked out three figures who are not what we would call mainstream Jewish thinkers to prove his point. I was fascinated by what he said. I didn't follow all of it, I must admit.
He's the most erudite individual I've ever come
Yeah,
across.
exactly.
He throws out
And you actually I forget which book collection of his. You can actually see the essay if you want. But in some ways, he was hearkening back to this notion that the text is the central idea. I mean, he in effect was giving an anti-Zionist speech at the heart of the JTS, okay, which was not well received, as you can imagine. Okay, but anyway, the revelation is limited to the covenant text. Only authoritative revelation for all time. Deuteronomy, in the eyes of Deuteronomy, is the only legitimate revelation. Secondly,
Which equals Torah.
ultimately it's the whole Torah, but Torah is teaching. So Torah eventually becomes the entire what we call Torah, but initially it's Deuteronomy, right? Now, what's fascinating is that creation is not mentioned. There's no creation material in D. Heaven and earth are only evoked as witnesses to the covenant. And if you compare, for example, the commandment to observe the Sabbath in the Deuteronomic version of the Ten Commandments, as opposed to the version in Exodus, the version in Exodus, what's the rationale for Shabbat? Because God rested on the seventh day. It's a creation rationale. In Deuteronomy, it's the Exodus. It's a historic rationale. The creation element is completely eliminated. So Deuteronomy is not interested in creation theology. It's interested in the notion of history, the sacred history. And the future, there will be future prophets, Deuteronomy says.
Sorry, Rabbi, how does he pass the Exodus to the Sabbath?
We'll take a look at it. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, that's the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. Remember, there's actually four different versions of the Ten Commandments in the
Very
Torah.
Powerful rationale. It's a great.
Yeah, there's the E version in Exodus, which is actually predates E. There's the J version, and then there's the P version, which is Leviticus 19, and this is the D version of it. So if you go to chapter 5, on page 387.
Just give us the J is where?
J is, I think, chapter 34 of Exodus.
Exodus
34. The E is Exodus 20. The P is Leviticus 19. And here is the D version, right?
D is what?
D is here, chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. And so it starts on verse 6, but take a look at verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. By the way, there's very few references in D to the notion of holiness. As the Lord your God has commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not do any work, your son, your daughter, your male, and so on and so forth. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. The rationale for it is the Exodus, not the creation. This is a big departure from the earlier form, which is God rested after 7 days, so you have to rest. So this is a great example of how, and again, you look through D, it doesn't talk about the origin of the universe. Okay? Now, future prophetic activity cannot supersede Mosaic revelation. In 2 places in Deuteronomy, they talk about possibility of prophets arising. One of them, in the earlier one, 13, deals with the notion of false prophets. But in chapter 16, it talks about the notion of true prophets. But the true prophet cannot contradict the teaching of Moses. All that prophet can do is exhort you to follow it. Any prophet that comes along and says to change something is a false prophet, and you put him to death. Okay? That's one of the critical criteria of it. If he's telling you to change something, he cannot be a prophet of God, because the prophecy of Moses, the revelation, is sacrosanct. Okay, the other interesting thing, and this is a big difference with P, by the way, is the ark is not the throne of or footstool of God. It's really not important in D. What is it? It's just a box to house the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Take a look at chapter 10. You'll see that. Moses is talking about, they've talked about the golden calf incident, and at the beginning of chapter 10, which is on page 397, God says, carve out 2 tablets of stone, like the first, come up to me, and make an ark of wood. And he tells you, I'm going to, inscribe it and deposit. So then he says, I made an ark of acacia wood and carved it out. So it's just a box. There's no gold on it. There's no golden top with the cherubim. The ark idea becomes incredibly unimportant in D. It's just a box because God can't live in the temple. So there is no seat of God in the Holy of Holies. There are no cherubim because D doesn't like angels. Okay.
What about the tablets themselves?
There are tablets, and they're,
Are they important?
Yeah, they are important. Okay. They're important, but the ark is just a box. That gets away from that whole P theology of the kavod, the presence of God, which is an old idea. It predates all of this, that God actually lives in the temple. Okay, turn over to the next page. Ritual. There's not a lot of stuff in Deuteronomy about sacrifice. it's really downplayed. It's not that there's nothing, but it's not that important. And there's virtually nothing about purity laws. I mean, there are the dietary laws are repeated, but compared to P, there's a real absence of this. And one of the most interesting things is that because you centralize the sacrifice, in other words, what is D trying to do? It's trying to limit sacrifice, right? It can only be done in one place. So that really severely limits sacrifice. And what happens now in the older theology, when you wanted to eat meat, you had to take the animal to a local shrine because all animal slaughter was an act of sacrifice. You had a local priest slaughter the animal. Part of the animal was always given to God to be burned on the altar of the local shrine. Part of it was given to the priest, and the rest you ate with your family in a sacred meal. You had to be in a state of ritual purity. So there was no such thing as secular slaughter of animals. Hunting was different. Hunting was not counted. But to bring it, because it's a wild animal, to bring a domestic animal, to eat a domestic animal, well, we're really talking not about birds, we're talking about, cattle, sheep, goats, cattle. You had to bring it to a shrine. Well, you shut down all the shrines, and there's only one place of sacrifice. How are people going to eat meat? Well, it says very particularly in chapter 12, you can eat meat. As long as you don't eat the blood,
Does
So,
that mean, though, before they were rarely eating meat? Or they just did a lot of offerings?
people didn't eat a lot of meat. And don't forget, because first of all, cattle you wanted to keep for the milk. Sheep and goats, by the way, you did have to cull the herds. You always had to cull the herds. And that's the reason why almost all the sacrifices are male. Because the male animals are the ones that you've got to get rid of. Because each kind of animal, whether it be cattle, sheep, or goats, you can only have a certain ratio of males to females, or the males start fighting. So, there's an exact ratio that they knew. You need one bull for so many cows, one ram for so many ewes, right? And so therefore, when you look in the Torah, almost all the sacrifices are males, because they're the ones who are, surplus, right? So there are certain times of the year when they cull the herds, when the males get to a certain age, and you'll notice the sacrifices tend to be the young males, like a year old, because that's when you're going to get rid of them. You're not going to keep them longer than that. That's when they ate meat. The rest of the time.
Passover sacrifice.
Well, exactly. The Passover.
Is that the timing of it?
Depends. Sometimes they culled them in the
From
fall.
the spring.
They culled them if they're born in the spring. Well, no, those are already a year old,
If
right?
they're born in spring, they're a year old.
Exactly.
You have a Passover
Exactly.
sacrifice,
So,
and every household is slaughtering a
yeah,
lamb.
absolutely. It's male.
Has to be a lot of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise-
And don't forget, there's also going to be a fall culling as well for some of them. But again, you don't want to kill off your animals. You don't eat a lot of meat because from the sheep you get milk and you get wool. From the goats you get milk. From the cows you get milk. So you don't want to kill. There isn't a lot of meat being eaten. But what happens is that in D, because of the centralization of the cult, you have secular slaughter. Okay? Now, again, the rituals are almost all connected with, a lot of the rituals are connected with the Exodus event. Okay? And a lot of the rationales for the laws are because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, like the Shabbat. So the Exodus event becomes the chief sort of under foundation of all of ritual. And prayer becomes a major religious act. As we will see in P, we have no evidence for prayer at all. But this is a very famous D passage. Go to 1 Kings chapter 8. I'm getting there. 1 Kings chapter 8 is found on page 727. Now, this is a very complex chapter, very carefully edited by the Deuteronomic historian. It's the dedication of the temple by Solomon. The first part of it is the old material. Okay, starting in verse 1, it talks about them bringing the ark. It talks about the kavod, the presence of God coming into the ark. Although there's a little bit, notice in verse 9, there was nothing inside the ark but the 2 tablets of stone which Moses placed there at Horeb. That's a D verse. When the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites, that's a D verse. But then in 10, it talks about how the presence of God comes in and the place fills with smoke. This is sort of a repetition of Exodus chapter 40, right? The proof that God approves the temple is the presence of God in the temple. Then, Solomon gives this prayer, okay? Now, when you read through Solomon's prayer, there's 2 phases of it, and the second phase begins in verse 22. This whole section now, till virtually the end of the chapter, and this is one of the longest chapters in the Bible, is a Deuteronomic prayer they put in the mouth of Solomon. Why? Because after having talked about all these hundreds and thousands of sacrifices that Solomon did when he dedicated the temple, this prayer now talks about, first of all, the covenant, but then it says, verse 27, but will God really dwell on earth? Even the heavens, their utmost reaches, cannot contain you. How much less this house I have built? God doesn't really live here. Yet turn, O Lord, my God, to the prayer and supplication of your servant, and hear the cry and prayer which your servant offers you today. May your eyes be open day and night towards this house, towards the place of which you said, my name shall abide there. That's Deuteronomy. May you heed the prayers which your servants will offer toward this place. This is written in Babylonia. And when you read through it, in effect says that prayer towards the temple will serve as atonement for sin. This is entirely antithetical to the whole sacrificial system of atonement sacrifices, sin offerings, which was central to the sacrificial system. And you can tell it's it's in the diaspora because it says, by the way, interestingly,
Why did you say it was written in Babylonia?
well, I'll show you. Take a look in verse 46 on page 731. When they sin against you, for there is no man who does not sin, and you are angry with them, and deliver them to the enemy and their captors, and carry them off to an enemy land, near or far, and then they take it to heart in their land to which they've been carried off, and they repent and make supplication to you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned, we have acted perversely, we have acted wickedly. Those phrases are used in the High Holiday liturgy, the exact words. And they turn back to you. This is repentance, right? Central theme in Deuteronomy. They turn back to you with all their heart and all their soul. Those are Deuteronomic phrases. In the land of their enemies who've carried them off, and they pray to you in the direction of their land, which you gave to their fathers, of the city which you have chosen, and of the house which I have built to your name. Oh, give heed in your heavenly abode to their prayer and supplication. This is Babylon. We're in Babylon. The D people are saying, if you pray towards Jerusalem, God will hear your prayer. This is the theology of diaspora that allows you to remain a member of God's people.
So help me out here because I'm getting confused in the chronology.
Yeah.
Because if D is Josiah, they're not in Babylon.
Deuteronomic historian is later. This whole thing is by this school.
So Deuteronomy is first.
Yes.
And then the school really develops
Yeah, if
later.
you look at like the material, I gave you the chart last time, you'll see the Deuteronomic history, right, comes out of D.
Right.
So,
Comes out of it.
in other words, the D school in Babylon takes all this earlier material. Maybe this even started before Babylon. They take all this earlier history and they completely shape it to their ideology. I mean, I showed you that, whenever they talk about a king and they don't like the king, they don't like most of the kings, right? Why? Because they didn't shut down their local shrines. Not that they were idol worshippers. What's their biggest criticism of most of the kings of Judea? Because they shut down the shrines. The ones they really hate are the ones who actually, are idolatrous, like Manasseh. But the point is, they shape the whole history of all this earlier material from Joshua to the end of 2 Kings. They're the editors of this. Okay? They take all the earlier material, including all the great stuff in Samuel's, of Samuel, Saul, and David, which was written by an earlier writer, and they shape it and edit it and put in what they want. And here's an example. You have this really old text about Solomon dedicating the temple, and they put this Deuteronomic prayer smack into the middle of it in order to say the temple is for prayer. This is really important because this is the theological foundation of the synagogue. It doesn't mean they had synagogues in Babylon, but we know that Jews were praying in the direction of Jerusalem. It's in the book of Daniel as well, that all you had to do was pray towards Jerusalem and God will hear your prayer. This is where it starts. Okay, exile and repentance, as I've already mentioned. Exile is the central punishment for violating the covenant, and it influences the editing of the Torah narratives. The text is Deuteronomy 30, but when you look in the story of Cain and Abel, what is Cain's punishment after he murders his son? Not that he's put to death, which under normal circumstances, and murder is punishable by the death penalty in the Bible. He is sent as an exile. And when you look at chapters 37 to 50, the Joseph story, there is this, in the Joseph story itself, there's this notion of the rise and fall. Joseph is high. He falls into the pit. He goes up to become the chief servant. He goes down into the jail. He then comes up and becomes the vizier. So that notion is very much part of the historical consciousness of the D people in the way they edited the stories of the judges. And the notion that they are down in Egypt, right? But they will return. Joseph says, at some point you're going to leave and you're going to go back to Canaan and take my bones with me. That whole ideology is Deuteronomic.
But the core of the story is not written.
No, it's not, but it's shaped by
At the
it.
very end.
I'm telling you,
Yeah.
they shaped all these narratives. This is a Joseph story is a J narrative, right? Yeah. But they shaped J to make it part of their ideology. The exile is the worst possible punishment, but you will return.
So you're saying the redactor of the Torah
Well,
fundamentally Deuteronomy.
one element of it is Deuteronomy.
Not
Not the final editing. No, not the final editing. But Deuteronomic editors undoubtedly had influenced the way the narratives were edited.
But they were exilic.
So
Yeah.
These were not the early Deuteronomy. Josiah is a different
Yeah, exactly.
group.
exile is worse than death.
Yeah, it is. It is worse than death because, well, first of all, it's communal. It's the nation. It's like exile is like the death of the nation. I mean, think about it. Ezekiel, when he has his vision of the bones, it's not a literal vision. It's a metaphor for the exile. We are dead. We are like dead, and we will come back to life, and God will restore us. Restoring to life is going back to our land.
If you're in exile, you can come back. If you're dead, you can't come back.
No, you're talking about the individual death. We're talking here about the death of the nation. Being in exile on some level is like the nation has died.
You wear the right clothes.
Right? If the nation, but the nation can come back. It's a national thing. It's not an individual idea. The worst punishment for the nation is not just foreign domination, but exile. But repentance and return is possible. That right in Deuteronomy itself, and in Deuteronomy 30, if you repent, God will bring you back. Okay. Any last questions about D before we go on to P?
Sure. I'm not trying to ask. So this is like very. So back a long time ago.
Yeah.
Almost at the time of the D history itself. when I studied, I took a course in the summer at JTS with a professor from Hebrew University, Alexander Rofek.
Uh-huh.
And he had his view of some of Deuteronomy being some of the most ancient kind of passages that we have.
Yes.
And in particular, the beginning of Kitav Vo, I remember studying with him,
Uh-huh.
which is the text which we know from the Haggadahs, where
Yes.
you come to Jerusalem, or it doesn't say Jerusalem. My father was a wandering Aramean.
Right,
and so
right.
in there, but it has the action of the people coming with their first fruits and then making this historical
Of the Exodus.
kind of declaration
That's
of the
D.
Exodus.
But that's the D ideology,
But-
right?
But what's so striking about it is there's no reference there to the covenant of Torah. There's no.
Yes,
It's just,
yes, that's
it,
true.
It and so his argument was that that's an ancient piece that depicts what people actually did as their early. Kind of
It's a possibility.
historical-
Look, there is old stuff in D. The law code in D is considered to be quite old. There's an earlier, like, again, in the chart, where I gave you, where it talks about, DTR1 and then DTR2. There is, the Deuteronomic thing actually goes through. And yes, the law code that is incorporated in D, it has some very early elements in it. There's no doubt about it, okay? But it gets, just like E incorporates the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant, which predates E, into its structure, assuming there is a separate E as opposed to JE. There's, again, we're going to see in P, they do the same thing. There's all this material that's floating around, but it's oral, but it becomes written. D is the one that really begins the notion of writing it down. Right? Yes, Robert.
I just wanted to comment, Rabbi, because we've been doing Deuteronomy 9 onwards, and I discussed with you in the Chazan Sword that fragment that this rabbi cut up and took with him during the war, and when he was dying, he gave it to this righteous Gentile.
Yeah,
And I
right.
always wondered why he had chosen to cut out
Deuteronomy.
that particular fragment, and the one he had cut out was 9 to 13. So that he found the Deuteronomic thing about the exile.
Yeah, exactly, of course.
I would have thought you could have gone back to Genesis or Exodus. I always wondered why he had chosen this. This is such a pivotal part.
Absolutely,
in the evolution of-
absolutely.
Where are you, 9?
The fragment that he cut out was four columns, and it starts at Deuteronomy 9, I think 14 or something.
Yeah, right.
And it goes through, and it always was of interest to me why he had chosen this particular bit to take with him.
Yeah, because it's about this notion of redemption. Okay, so we're now going to talk about the other school or religious tradition, the P tradition. Now, I will tell you the dating of the P material is an extremely contentious issue in biblical scholars. Okay? We do know that the Torah, the way we have it, is ultimately a product of the P school. They're the ones who edited JE and their material together to produce the 4 books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Okay? They're the part of the P school did that ultimate. So the redacting stuff really was the P people, and this goes all. And then bringing in the D, they did that too because they put in a little bit of their own stuff at the end of Deuteronomy and a little bit of E, and so they are the ones who ultimately produced the 5-book Torah, probably in Babylon. Okay, and maybe the absolute final layer of editing may have been done after the return from the exile, very likely. But they're the ones who ultimately produce the whole thing, but they incorporate D. Okay, whether the D people went into a grand coalition with them or not, I don't know. But the point is, though, the P people were a separate group from D, and the question is, how old is this material? In the beginning of the whole history of the study of these schools, Wellhausen assumed that all the P stuff was late. But that was because of his own prejudice against the notion of ritual because he was Protestant, okay? The fact is there's some very early material in what we call P, and there's an evidence of a revolution within P. So here's how I put it out. Again, this is extremely contentious, and I'm following basically Jacob Milgram here. What you have is, you have this very early material from the original Israelite Judean religion, which is the teaching, which is the actual way of texts of the people who ran the shrines, right? The priests who did the sacrifices, okay? We're calling this PT, priestly Torah. Some of this material goes back to the 12th century BCE and very likely is from Shiloh, the temple at Shiloh that is destroyed. All right? In the 11th century. And then this is transferred to the priestly establishment in Jerusalem. So very likely that's the historical evolution. You have this, the main shrine, the main group of priests at Shiloh, you've got all the other local priests and so on, but there's this group at Shiloh that has these, all their traditions, which is probably oral or some of it was written down, but essentially it's for their own use. It's their own instruction manuals. That's the beginning of the big chunk of the beginning of Leviticus is essentially an instruction manual for the priests themselves. All right? Now,
I think that's from the PT.
Yeah, that's the PT stuff. The point is, in other words, Leviticus chapters 1 to 16 is basically the PT stuff. Okay?
Leviticus 1
to 16. I've got it written down here for you, right? And there's other materials throughout, Genesis and Exodus and Numbers. There's a lot of stuff from that early material. Okay? Then, there is at the same time the Deuteronomic revolution has its origins in the north, in Jerusalem you have a group of priests who produce what is called H, the Holiness Code. And that's Leviticus 17 to 26. It's been long recognized that there is a totally distinct priestly ideology in the latter half of the book of Leviticus, which emphasizes the notion of Kedusha,
And this is
holiness.
They're in Jerusalem, you think?
Yeah, they're in Jerusalem. You see it in Numbers, you see it in Exodus. In other words, this is the school these are the people who are very likely shaping a lot of this other earlier material. Okay? And what happens is that when you get the PT and the H, then you get P. Then they pull in the JE material, that's the first R/P. They do this redacting of all of the JE material to fit it in with their material. Okay, and there's where you get the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers as a text. And by the way, they are very likely doing this in reaction to D, because there is evidence within the P material of a polemic against D. Okay? So there is a contention about what's going on.
What's the conflict? What's the issue?
There's all kinds of things about the priestly stuff. I mean, it's very technical in some respects, but there's no doubt about the fact that in some of the P material, they are reacting against D, the later P material. Okay? So, and they're also, of course, rejecting the earlier ideology that's in J and E. In other words, they're a lot stricter monotheists than the old stuff, but they're different than D. They're not as strict as D. Then they're the guys who bring D into the whole complex, and they're very likely the final redactors that produce the 5-book Torah. Because the 5-book Torah really does, when you look at it, the whole editing of it, it definitely reflects this P material, the early stuff plus H.
So why do they include D?
Again, maybe there was a grand coalition. Maybe they all just decided in the exile they had to come together. There's, who knows?
Kind of amazing without internet and phones.
Hey, look, there weren't that many of these guys. Remember, you're talking about a very small group of literate people, right? You're not talking about a mass movements here.
And particularly in exile, it would make sense.
Absolutely. It's the time when you want to pull together.
Only a certain number of the people survived. I brought my scroll with me. You brought your scroll
Yeah.
with you. We're all living in Babylon in the same neighborhood. We're going to sit down and we're like, oh, well, this is your thing says this and my thing says that. I think it actually makes sense. Well, they're both right,
Right, and I'm gonna my people.
We don't
I'm
have any power anymore. So
we're preserving our guy Jeremiah, and we're preserving our history, our shaping of the the Joshua to 2 Kings history. But ultimately they all come together.
And you're of the approach that one of the main motivators for the creation of these scrolls is the people feeling that it might disappear and being in that kind of situation like exile.
Absolutely.
You need to write it all down and make sure it doesn't.
But you see, what's interesting is that Milgram shows how H is doing the same social critique in the time in the end of the 8th century BCE that the prophets, the D people in the north at the time of the destruction of the north are doing against the stuff in the north. In other words, there's this tremendous prosperity, but there's also tremendous social inequality. So there are elements of the same kind of societal
H.
Yes, H has the same. There are elements of the same kind of societal critique in H that you find in the prophets of the north who are preaching, in the time of Jeroboam II, like Hosea and Amos.
Could you give us an example of how the H?
You'll see. Okay.
So
The other important thing is that the prophet Ezekiel has very close connections to the H school. Okay, so he's part of that. Remember, he's in exile. He goes to Babylon in the first wave. So he is a critical figure in all of this.
So you think that H is that late?
Yeah, H is the end of the 8th century BCE.
8th century is not.
Yeah, no, it's at the time of the destruction of the north. That's when H starts.
Right, but Ezekiel's later.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that Ezekiel shows a lot of connections to the theology of H, who are the ones who ultimately pull together all of the P material, right? So H is separate from the PT originally, but then is edited in by the H people into the single P text, right? And then they also then bring in J and E, okay?
So this whole theory, hypothesis, whatever you call it,
Yeah.
is this the way it started with Wellhausen and all these?
It started with Wellhausen, but it's been refined and
based on like archaeology.
Archaeology and analysis of the text in a much better way than he could,
So the
and
way
linguistics and philology and all kinds of stuff. But again, there are different scholars have different versions of this, by the way. Okay?
But the fact that you once said that even the JTS group kind of buying into that.
Everybody does. Everybody except the Orthodox accepts the fact of the multi-source origins.
But that's
The details they're arguing about.
Mm-hmm.
The details are argued about. The dating is arguing about it, right?
even modern Orthodox are away from it, or they.
Well, that's a very touchy question for some of them. They don't necessarily want to express publicly their belief in this or not. For example, I have no idea what David Hartman thought of these things, for example, because they just didn't talk about it.
I mean, I know one Syrian rabbi who just passed away, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Great rabbi who
Yeah.
married us.
Yeah.
And I was talking to him one time, and when he talks to my brother-in-law, he talks one
Yeah, right,
conversation,
right.
and then when my brother-in-law moves away, we have another conversation. Because his daughter went to Hartman and, studied. His daughter is Orthodox, but obviously. So I guess it is a good.
Well, the thing is, one of the key differences between the Orthodox and everybody else is the acceptance of the notion that the Torah is a multi-authored document that evolves over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. That's one of the separations. The acceptance of the fact that, the Torah is a process and not an event. Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll go through this in more detail next time, but again, the priestly cultic religion, as Geller calls it, is strictly monotheistic, but in its own way. All right? There is a covenant there. It is, unlike D, it's creation-centered, not Exodus-centered. Okay?
With the H?
Yeah, in P in general, but especially in H, it's creation-centered. It's not Exodus-centered so much. Revelation for P is through the tabernacle. If you take a look, if you parse out P's version of the Sinai event, the only thing that Moses gets on Mount Sinai is the instructions for the building of the tabernacle. Once the tabernacle is built, the book of Leviticus begins with God talking out of the tabernacle and Moses. That's where the revelation begins. The revelation is after the Sinai, through the tabernacle, not on Mount Sinai.
So that
Sinai is only the instructions to build the tabernacle in P. That's the only thing that Moses gets. He gets the design. That's the whole latter, the whole part of the book of Exodus with all the instructions of the tabernacle. That's P's revelation on Sinai. So only after they build the tabernacle and the divine presence comes into it at chapter 40 of Exodus, you have to look at this, forget the end of Exodus and Leviticus are separate
Ten
books.
Commandments not part of P.
What?
10 Commandments are not part of P.
No, they have their own 10 Commandments. It's in chapter 19. Okay? The point is,
Leviticus.
yes, it's not in the earlier P. There is no 10 Commandments. There's just a bunch of rules on purity and priestly
So the
stuff.
Holiness Code is their 10 Commandments.
Yeah, the chapter 19 is their 10 Commandments. There's no doubt about it. The point is that the whole revelation comes after the building of the tabernacle through God's presence living in the tabernacle. That's P's version of all of this. Okay? What you find, of course, in P is an extreme emphasis on ritual and holiness, and we'll go into this more detail. But that's the radical difference with D, right? Sacrifice is incredibly important. Purity laws are extremely important. And there's virtually no prayer, right? The only thing we know of that's a piece of liturgy is the priestly blessings in number 6.
Why is there no prayer? In what?
In P, there's no prayer mentioned. In the whole ritual of all that they describe in the temple, they never mention the priest doing any prayer. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but this is the ideology of P. That's not important to them. The sacrifices are what is important. Okay? In P, the priests are restricted to the descendants of Aaron, and the Levites have a secondary role, and that wins out ultimately. They also believe that blood and atonement, the whole theology of blood atonement comes out of P. It's a very old idea. But when you take a look at the holidays are connected to the creation cycle, Yom Kippur is extremely important as an annual purging of sin. Don't forget, in D, there is no Yom Kippur. There's no Yom Kippur in D. There's no Rosh Hashanah. It's just the pilgrimage holidays, right? And the purity system is extremely part of their whole underlying theology and ethical system.
How would you say D doesn't have Yom Kippur based on?
You look in the calendar.
It's only the.
There's no.
the
Yeah, it's just
Regalim.
Shlosh Regalim. There's no Yom Kippur. And their whole symbolic system is the victory of life over death. Purity equals life, impurity equals death. And we'll go into this more because there's a strong attack on pagan theology and demons and magic in P. And as much as D is against demons and magic, in many ways it's a lot stronger in P. The rules against doing magical practices are a lot stricter and more elaborate in the P law code, especially in H, than you'll find even in D. Okay.
Sometimes you can take a whole section of laws and trace it to different sources. And
Yeah, or chunks of law.
like in Deuteronomy 19, what would be different?
No, in Leviticus 19.
I mean Leviticus 19.
Yeah, Leviticus. It's all. I mean, most of that is H all the way through. Okay, but the point is, you can pick out where, for example, when they do the editing of the JE material, there's little bits here and there that you can say are P material has been stuck in there. Okay, we're going to stop now. And we'll see you next week, which is our last class. And I wish you a good week.
Robert, you have an